You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome, and we're going to have a special segment starting off right now discussing something that I don't believe anyone else is really getting into, but we felt like we had to. So from the Center of Security Policy, William Philbin and Tommy Waller are two experts there, and they're going to discuss with us a topic which is very troubling to me, and that is how we use the National Guard here in America and deploying them overseas, but also when the president made the statement, and fellows, I was a little troubled when the president said, let's use our National Guard to go fight Ebola in Africa. And I'm sure that you guys may have had the same types of thoughts running through your head.
Yeah, so this is Bill, and first off, just let me say thanks for having us on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys. I guess what this really gets to, at least in my mind, is it gets to, the use of the military writ large, National Guard, obviously, in this particular instance, but the use of the military writ large to do sort of the heavy lifting required of any kind of a serious, or whenever there's any kind of a serious requirement for aid overseas, principally because, the discipline, the capability, the organization of the military makes it kind of unique in the federal government in that, we have a bunch of guys and gals that know what the heck they're doing. They have the equipment to get over there. They have the discipline and the training. We're used to operating in austere environments. So, I guess there's a fundamental logic, if you will. And the larger question, of course, is why does an agency for international development or the State Department or, other branches of the government, why don't we have this capability? But that's sort of why the military always ends up with these missions. That said, I think the more fundamental message is, or the more fundamental concern is sending guys into this particular area to deal with this particular crisis. The military obviously has a medical capability, and as a matter of fact, the leading experts on this, or the guys that are most familiar with this, are the guys up at USARMID, the U.S. Army Medical Institute up in Fort Detrick, Maryland. It's the old chemical warfare, biological warfare branch. And I think it was in '72 when we signed the treaty, Nixon signed the treaty outlawing biological weapons. USARMID continued to exist, but it just shifted its role from an offensive to a defensive mission. So there is certainly a capability, and there is certainly an expertise in a portion of the U.S. military to deal with this. But, the average, I think, Navy Mobile Hospital or Army Field Hospital is no better trained to, deal with Ebola than the guys at Texas Presbyterian were down there in Dallas.
Yeah, well, that's a great point, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go right ahead, please.
Oh, what I was going to say is, my first thought was that, obviously the military has, had to look at the threats involved in chemical weapons and biological weapons, and so I'm sure that they have units that are specially trained to deal with and medical staff that has experience in this area. But the first question that calls into my mind is, does the average National Guard troop, while he may train on weapon systems and may have been in combat, you're talking about a completely different scenario. So if their purpose is to simply to help create order and be an assist in some way, I could understand that. But are they properly trained to be able to deal with this particular threat, being Ebola? And secondly, do they know how to protect themselves, or will they be given the proper training to protect themselves from the threat of catching Ebola themselves?
My knowledge on the level of training that they get comes from a press article that I read, I want to think on Drudge, 2 days ago, and it pointed out that these guys are getting a whopping total of 4 hours of training before they go downrange on the specifics of Ebola. Now, the reality is learning to, what's required to teach yourself to not get Ebola is not exactly a complicated set of instructions. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's make sure you have the gear on and make sure you don't come in contact with what we believe to be, the current vectors for the disease, bodily fluids, vomit, feces, that kind of stuff. That said, these guys that are going down range, first off, the average guy out there, the average soldier, sailor, marine, airman, is going to get a certain amount of training in chemical warfare. But they're going to get it in chemical warfare, and it's going to be infrequent because we don't really do that much. I mean, there's a requirement for training. I would say the average National Guardsman probably learned this stuff to one degree or another when they went through boot camp, and probably haven't paid a whole lot of attention to it since. In the field of biological warfare, nobody really trains with that anymore. I mean, the closest we've come to that in the last 20 years was, the anthrax attacks and the anthrax scare that occurred right after the 9/11 attacks. So people sort of, started to pay attention to it again, but the kind of, active virus vectors that we're dealing with here, the military doesn't train for that because that's not the stuff that's weaponized and used, in even a biological warfare scenario. In terms of background on this, if people want to read a couple of really good books to get more data on this, there's a gentleman named Richard Preston who wrote a book called The Demon in the Freezer. And what that's about is it's about biological weapons, specifically the issue of smallpox and weaponized smallpox, and what the Soviets did with that in the late 80s and the early 90s. Now, it doesn't address Ebola specifically, but what it does do is it gives you a very good sense of the understanding of what a weaponized biological weapon can do. What the troops are facing, anybody working in that zone over there is facing right now, isn't really, a weaponized agent, but it's more just a naturally occurring infectious agent. And the reality is, being around that stuff when you're in, a hot environment, whether it's chemical or biological, it's extremely confining and it's extremely hard. And the vast majority of times where you get casualties in environments like that isn't necessarily when you're suited up and you're in the hot environment. It's when you're leaving the hot environment, getting out of the hot environment, getting out of your gear, because the outside of your gear is contaminated. And that's when people make mistakes, and that's when, if anybody is going to get, Ebola, if any of these guys are actually going to be exposed to this disease and come down with this disease, that's likely when it's going to occur. It's going to occur in those transition periods. Or someone's going to, make a mistake and stick a needle through a glove or slice their hand and, end up exposed, to contaminated material.
Yeah, I'm so glad.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I'm so glad that you brought that up. I'm sure we've all seen the movie Outbreak, where the one doctor on the team rips the suit and gets infected, and then you hear all the recent stories about talking about the nurses that got contaminated, and then they're talking about how they have to retrain on how to take off their protective gear and how to put it on and take it off and clean things properly so they don't get exposed to some of the contaminants. And I think that is important. And again, that's the type of thing that how do you teach that in 3 or 4 hours of training?
Correct. Well, and I apologize, Tommy, I'm walking on you, but the reality is you don't. And I guess really the thing to put the perspective of just how well trained are the soldiers to deal with this, or to put the issue of how well trained the soldiers how well trained are the soldiers to deal with this? Sorry, I'm having a hard time with the language today. To put that in perspective, consider what's happening in medical environments. So, Miss Pham, and I think the other nurse's name was, I want to think it was Vincent. These are two people who are medical professionals who do this. They're used to normal contamination procedures. They deal with infectious agents, not necessarily Ebola, but they deal with infectious agents in hospitals all the time. And these are two people that got it. One of the things that bothers me about the whole mantra coming out, I have to be careful. I don't want to fearmonger by any means, and I certainly don't mean that. But one of the things that bothers me about this, don't worry, we got a handle on it. We have advanced sanitation procedures or advanced sanitation processes in America. And yes, our medical system is orders of magnitude better than the medical system that, exists in the part of the world where this comes from. But, there's this thing called MRSA that, anybody who's, spent any time in a hospital in the last 15 years is no doubt aware of. And, and it's essentially antibiotic-resistant staph. And MRSA is, a biological infection that developed in and is primarily spread in hospital environments where we routinely practice all these sanitation procedures. Now, thankfully, MRSA isn't anything like Ebola or Lassa or Marburg or any of those other hemorrhagic fevers, but it's still a very, very serious problem. So the idea that, we're going to be in an environment and we're going to be using modern medical sanitary procedures, therefore we have nothing to worry about, I don't draw a great deal of personal comfort from that. I think there's still significant risk.
Yeah, I would say this comes down to the issue of trust, and the reality is poor governance / leadership is a big. MRSA is a perfect example of that, because how many decades have we been told and warned that we have to be very careful about abusing antibiotics, either insisting for them for things like viruses and colds that they do nothing for, or not taking them properly, which usually means not completing the dose. So I feel better, I'm going to stop. Or you get a lot of ignorant people who say, I'm going to use half of it now and save the next half, which, of course, all that does is mostly kill, and a handful of the elements that the bacteria that live then grow and become superviruses, thus the problem you're having with something like MRSA. And so you have failures at all levels, from individuals to doctors to the advertising agencies to the Center for Disease Control and government agencies up down the line. And I think trust is a big issue here. But I want to change this conversation slightly, because I want to go back to the original supposition here, which was the appropriateness or not of the use of the National Guard. And I want to just touch briefly, and I assume you guys probably know this, but for the benefit of our audience, the National Guard is a very interesting structure, and it's changed quite a bit throughout the years. It was sort of an ongoing evolution from state militias on through after the Spanish-American War, when we realized, we really don't have a big enough standing army. And again, after World War I, we started having a larger standing army, and we started to reconstruct and reform the militias and the state's National Guards to be somewhat of a combination of a state force as well as a backup for the federal force. But one of the things that really strikes me as we go through sequestration and the normal pattern we seem to have, which is, after you have enough time with Democrats in office, they seem to want to neuter the military and ignore the reality of today's and tomorrow's threats. And what bothers me about this entire equation is it seems like what we're doing is we're trying to take our military reserve force, a la the National Guard, most of whom are not full-time service members, most of whom have full-time jobs and are actually part of our reserve force, and treating them as though they were our basic army. And I think that's a huge problem, first off, because it leaves us ill-prepared if we do have another major conflagration, because we're calling in our reserves to do what we should be doing with base folks. But again, because they're not doing this full-time, are they really properly trained and ready to handle all of these circumstances? And, that's the big question we have to pose.
I probably need to, stop dominating this conversation and let Tommy get a word in edgewise here. But what I would tell you is, that the way the Guard is structured now and the Reserve is structured now, sort of at the 10,000, 30,000 foot level, And one of the reasons, therefore, that you see a lot of the guard units activated for disaster relief and other kinds of emergencies is the guard and the reserve is where a lot of the specialized units are. Okay, during the 80s, when we were getting ready to fight the Soviets in Central Europe and all that. The Guard was structured in such a way that each division had 2 active duty brigades, and it had something called a roundout brigade. So the Guard had a lot of combat units in it, infantry brigades, armor brigades. Well, when we went to the Gulf War in 91, we mobilized all those roundout brigades, and there were some spectacular failures. There was one brigade in particular, and I forget which state. It might have been Georgia, but I might be wrong, and I don't want to disparage the people of Georgia if I am wrong. But there was one brigade that literally spent the entire war at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin trying to get qualified and trying to get the thumbs up to go downrange. Now, a number of other brigades went downrange fine, but what it basically pointed out was there was a problem in keeping too much combat power in the Guard and the Reserve because those guys didn't have the opportunity to train as coherent higher-level formations on enough time. So, the individual machine gunners, the individual riflemen, they knew their jobs, but where it was falling down was at the battalion, the regiment, the brigade level. The staffs just didn't know. They didn't have the experience. They couldn't operate. So after the Gulf War, what you find is, and then also this is also because of the defense drawdown under the Clinton administration, you find a lot of specialized units that go back off into the Guard and go into the reserves. And when you think about it, that also makes sense because, as you point out, most of these guys, this is their day job. When you mobilize, the Seabees from the reserve Seabee battalions, you get a bunch of guys that work construction, so they can, work miracles for you when they get on the front line. So because of the way we've structured our force, in many ways, we don't really have the ability. Like, for instance, most MP units are in the reserves. So when you get to a situation where you're in a war, and now one of the big things that an MP does, an MP unit does, is they do prisoner control. They take care of your detainees, and they set up temporary internment camps, and they allow you to sort through and sort the wheat from the chaff as you're processing prisoners. You can't do that with the active duty force. So to a degree, because of the force structure decisions that have been made over time, when we go to deal with something other than just a straight up fight, we have to rely on the Guard and the Reserve. Not only that, even when we go to a straight up fight, we have to rely on the Guard and the Reserve because we've shrunk the active duty military so much. Those capabilities aren't in the military, in the active duty military. That's a purely budgetary decision that's been made. And in fairness, it's been made by administrations of both parties. And if you read Eric Prince's recent book, Eric Prince was the guy that owned Blackwater, and he put out a book about a year or so ago. A point that Prince makes in that book that I find fascinating is actually that not only have we shifted a lot of capability into the Guard and Reserve, therefore requiring us to mobilize Guardsmen and Reservists to deal with national problems, especially national problems overseas, we structured the military in such a way that we kind of can't go to war without even contractors now. And I apologize. I realize that's far afield from the subject you want to cover, but I just would put that in perspective.
No, I actually don't apologize. I want to go down that rabbit hole in a minute with you because I think it's pretty interesting. The tactical teams for dealing with special circumstances does make sense. I understood that to a degree, but I think you just pointed out that it's probably much more a part of the overall structure and required force than I would expect. But I go back to the comment I made. I still think it's so risky to have too small a standing army for the very simple reason, the Center for Security Policy, of course, does a lot of work also in trying to help keep the electric grid safe from natural as well as man-made disasters, that could take the grid down and really undermine the entirety of our civilization, because without electricity we go back to the Dark Ages. So I would make the comparison that no matter how much you create new green technologies, taking energy back out of car batteries from distributed electric vehicles, for example, is never quite the same as having big baseload coal or nuclear plants that you will always provide enough reliable juice to sustain and grow an economy. And it seems to me that there's a similar parallel. But moving over to the question that you just posed for me here is, when you look at organizations like Blackwater, it seems to me that virtually every Hollywood director who's ever addressed this subject has made these military men for hire the show's primary antagonist. What's your sense of how important and the quality and the viability that these companies, these supplementary military for hire forces, actually serve to both for America in terms of directly supplementing our military, but also for the companies that we rely on, like our gas and mining and minerals and other major companies who have to be protected on foreign lands?
I'm happy to answer that one, but since I've been dominating the conversation so much, I was going to see if Tommy wanted to offer his
sure.
some thoughts on that first.
Absolutely. Brett, so the question as to the importance that private security contractors pay, that's a big subject. And I'm going to tell you, I'm very thankful that those guys exist, that those guys are willing to sacrifice and go overseas to do a mission where they don't have the same medical and logistical support that we do when we're in uniform conducting a combat deployment. Those have become crucial to our operations overseas for a number of reasons. In some cases, there are things that the U.S. government wants to do that it just can't do with its own people, that it has to pay someone else to do. In other cases, they just, hey, if you're given a cap in the number of U.S. military personnel due to political constraints, then you end up having to accomplish the mission some other way, which, of course, then calls for private security companies. And I think that's some of the things that Bill talked to with his book to describe how we've essentially created the requirement. We have conditioned the American people to think that we can go and win wars in a matter of days with very few troops. And that's just not the reality. And so because we've conditioned the American people that way, and because political leaders oftentimes won't have the courage to say, hey, this is going to be a long and arduous fight that's going to require the backing of an entire civilization, because we don't have the courage to say that in our political leadership, we have created a condition where people expect a very small force to do miracle work, and then that then levies the requirement for us to have to outsource a lot of the heavy lifting. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if Bill has anything else.
Well, what I'd add to that too is what most people don't understand is, the private military or the private security contractors, for the most part, those guys did their work primarily not for the military or not with the military, but primarily providing protective service details for State Department guys. The infamous incidents that got Blackwater in so much trouble, for the most part, like the shooting at I think it's Nasir Square. As a matter of fact, I saw something. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I just saw something on the web this morning that there was a verdict that was just handed down in that case, and the four Blackwater security guys, I guess, were actually found guilty. But those guys were out there providing security to State Department diplomats. And the vast majority of what Blackwater did, and companies like Blackwater did, was to provide that security to those other folks. Either other government agencies or in some cases, private companies. And like Tommy pointed out, when those guys go down range, and this really truly becomes the issue, especially if going forward we can't fight wars without these guys. if we don't have to, because if you didn't have Blackwater in country, you would have had to have brought in another 20,000 troops or whatever the heck it is, perhaps not, maybe 10,000, but you would have needed more troops to provide security for those, for those State Department guys. And the reality is the average rifle squad isn't trained for personal security detail stuff. They're trained for locate, close with, and destroy the enemy. Different tactics, different mindset, so forth. But when the private security companies go downrange, those guys don't have Geneva Convention status. Like as Tommy pointed out, they don't have the medical that we just take for granted when we go there. You're kind of in a very nebulous situation when it comes to international law. There are a lot of foreign governments that would look at these guys as simply mercenaries. And if you're out there as a mercenary, and you're not adhering to, you're not adhering to the niceties that are laid out in the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions, the law doesn't protect you.
Yeah, and Brett, I'd like to add, just like Bill said, the term nebulous doesn't give you a warm and fuzzy. It doesn't give you a whole lot of comfort when you talk about really what is the military there for, what are these contractors there for. And at the end of the day, if we're employing force of the United States of America, it should be to protect the Constitution of the United States of America. And in my mind, there's no room for nebulousness in this. You talked about trust earlier as a factor. I think we have to. This is the time for lawmakers to be asking the big questions about the employment of the military, whether it's National Guard supporting the Ebola, or whether it's just what our guys in uniform are taught and what they're not taught. Our military is there to defend that Constitution. That litmus test needs to be in place every single time we look to use them or train them. And that's the piece that concerns me time after time over the last 6 years as I've seen the employment of the military. How much of that is in defense of the Constitution? Because I would argue, you brought up the point earlier about the resiliency of our power grid. There are two things that we at the Center for Security Policy see as existential threats to that Constitution and to our civilization. One is the global jihadist movement, because it's got 270 million humans and 1,400 years worth of proven history to dominate every civilization that Sharia, Islamic law, enters. And the other is the resiliency of our power grid. And I can tell you right now that those that take an oath to defend our Constitution are not trained or employed in a way that addresses those two existential threats. We're not allowed to talk about jihad or be trained about the very fundamentals of Sharia that animate the global jihadist movement. And our own National Guard, our own military, is not required to train to a standard that would be in response to a grid-down scenario. So, my 2 cents on that are if we trust our leadership to do the right thing with our military, we need to go back to what are those existential threats to our Constitution and our civilization.
And Tommy, I absolutely agree with that. We're very short on time. I just want to throw out 2 statements because among some of the things we discussed, I feel as though in Benghazi we relied upon Libyan security forces as opposed to our own people that we knew we could trust, and that was obviously a huge mistake. And then one other thing to just question is, when some of these private security forces are either killed or injured, are they included in the counts of that we keep track of in the wars that we fight? And we have about 30 seconds.
In terms of casualty figures, I think the answer to that is no.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Brett, it's a sad situation where I've seen in Iraq myself where convoys of contractors would be killed and they'd be on the side of the road there. And I wondered who was coming to get them and who was taking toll of that sacrifice. So I think the answer is probably no to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, gentlemen, William Philbin and Tommy Waller, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'd really love to do it again. We enjoyed all the insight that both of you shared with us and our audience. This was a fantastic segment. And again, thank you so much to the Center for Security Policy And, of course, you can go to centerforsecuritypolicy.org and find out more about what these gentlemen and everyone else, including Frank Gaffney, are working on. And, again, guys, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Our pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Anytime.
Okay, take care, fellas. Have a great afternoon.
Okay.
You too.
You as
Bye-bye.
well. Bye-bye.